After a very quiet 2011, Brian Dougans and Cobain came back in style in 2012, with not only multiple different projects releasing new material, but also what could realistically be considered the first proper new FSOL album since the 1990s. Excitement was rife, although slightly tempered by its title. Welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London, and this week we're opening up 2012 with a look at, among other things, Environments 4. But we'll start with the Amorphous Androgynous, a monstrous psychedelic bubble exploding in your mind. Solid Steel Radio, 20th of April 2012.
The Amorphous Androgynous, bringing you another monstrous psychedelic bubble.
So announces Gaz at the start of this unusually short 30-minute broadcast. Solid Steel is a show hosted by DJ Food, who've been working with Brian and Gaz on new material in 2011, some of which was played in this show. Solid Steel itself dated back to the late 80s on Kiss FM and was hosted by Cold Cut, often around the same time as FSOL's legendary Kiss transmissions. Indeed, Brian and Gaz even reappropriated elements of their Kiss shows for a broadcast on Solid Steel at the start of the 90s. The Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble Mix starts with a new direction, surf rock on Link Wray's marvellous Switchblade. This is followed by an unreleased Amorphous track, the funky Ripped Off, sampling Gil Scott Heron's powerful poem Bicentennial Blues. Then there's some ethnic-tinged folk from Black Sun Ensemble, a proggy Pink Floyd instrumental over which spoken samples from Is This Real make an unexpected appearance. Mike Oldfield's playful On Horseback follows. This was a lovely moment for me, as Onward Dawn has been one of my favourite albums since my early teens. After a brief Yoko Ono snippet, the second half of the mix consists largely of two Amorphous collaborative projects. The first fruits of the Noel Gallagher production job with Shoot a Hole into the Sun, and part of the collaboration/remix project Electric Images in My Mind with the show's host DJ Food, with an Ian Neal track from the first Monstrous Bubble CD thrown in for good measure at the end. At 30 minutes, it's not the most in-depth mix, although the exclusive Amorphous track makes it of some interest. Bootleg copies circulate online, although no version is currently available on YouTube or Mixcloud. It's never been given a number as part of the series or an official release through the pod room. The Future Sound of London, Papua New Guinea original, Murmurations. Release date 21st of April 2012. Back in the day, when Record Store Day was still a comparative novelty, releases were ludicrously limited and were largely bought by scalpers who then stick them on eBay for 150 quid. Jumpin' and Pumpin' suggested a release, so we got Papua New Guinea on one side and Murmurations on the other. There's clearly no musical link between the two, this being a typical Record Store Day cash-in. Still, if any low-effort release was going to grab the attention of buyers, it would be the band's best-known track, the iconic hit that pushed the boundaries of dance music, as it says on the promotional sticker, combined with a track described as the first new FSOL track in years. Incorrect, incorrect, incorrect. The release also acted as a bit of a promo single for Environments 4, with Murmurations featuring on that album released just over a week later. So in that sense, it's the first time since the 90s that a physical promotional release of a single promoting an album had come out before the album itself. No actual artwork at all, although JMP did their job brilliantly by revisiting the label designs for the 2006 Papua New Guinea reissue, and then accidentally leaving the additional production and remix by Heard and White credit on the Murmurations side, as well as stating it was recorded at Earthbeat and is published by Garber Music. Bravo, Passion Music. The Future Sound of London, Environments 4, release date 30th of April 2012. Environments 4 was announced in the sleeve of Environments 3, cover and all, 2 years before its release. Which is kind of weird when you think about it, because a fair amount of this material couldn't have even been recorded when the cover was completed. What's even weirder in that context is how well the art fits the music. Indeed, Buggy had produced the artwork before hearing the completed album, a very rare occurrence, and the art itself actually fed into the inspiration behind the recording of the record. With Environments 3 featuring all of the known new music from the time, Glitching Cellular Memories, Summer's Dream, The Oldest Lady, Heartsick Chord, there was beginning to be some suspicion that the long-awaited new album wasn't really going to happen in conventional fashion, and there was some thought about whether Environments 4 would be it. With Murmurations promoted as a new track on the Record Store Day single released 9 days before the album, this seemed to be the case, although the album's blurb seemed to suggest otherwise, saying Environments 4 is another of the great lost albums by the Future Sound of London. These sessions have taken on an almost mythical status within the group's fanbase, but the difference is the group have been back in the studio adding new ideas to older recordings, and Murmurations is a brand new track. Given that almost exactly the same wording was used for the previous volume, however, it was taken with a pinch of salt. Nevertheless, there was some intrigue about just what would be on the album. Only a handful of tracks previewed on Electric Brainstorms Volume 7 the year before gave any idea of the record's direction. Dark, ambient, organic, maybe even acoustic. Promotion actually began a couple of months before release with a very vague YouTube video of the title floating above a field, but no music. In March, Juno added a clip of Murmurations to advertise the Record Store Day 10-inch, accidentally uploading a remix of Gregory Porter's jazz song 1960 Watt to much confusion. Then, a week before release, sound clips started appearing on both Brian and Gaz's YouTube accounts. This was the first real engagement with FSOL from Gaz since 2009's live shows, and this alone fired up even more expectation about this being the fabled new album. The first clip was unsurprisingly Murmurations. It caused a lot of immediate confusion by sounding like Amorphous. People began to wonder whether this was basically just going to be an instrumental Amorphous Androgynous album now Gaz was more involved. Up next were Stand a Little Less, Between Me and the Sun, Clear Light of Reality and Fibrillation, all very much on the ambient end of things with clear acoustic instrumentation in the mix. There began to be a lot of excited discussion about this being clearly new material and blending the sounds of FSOL and Amorphous. Shortly after, an email went out from FSOL Digital describing the album. The 14-track journey from the river's delta to no man's land, where Murmurations lead across supercontinents and back to the clear light of reality. Strings meet choirs cascading down to the glass valleys of synthesised biophony. Exciting. FSOL Digital purchasers were also sent a bonus track on release called Plough. The question that arises then is Environments 4 the new album? And while the answer is technically no, it's more of a no, but it might as well be, than a no, it's another set of archive tracks. There are hints of older tracks on here. Fibrillation and Plough are radically reworked versions of Glacier. There are some bleeps from the outer environment of Glass, used briefly in Long Day, and Sunset starts with an environment that dates back to the Kiss FM transmissions. But as a listening experience, and in terms of the completion of the tracks itself, it feels, sounds and effectively is a totally new FSOL album. When I first played it to my partner, she responded by saying, "It doesn't sound like FSOL," and that's pretty much right. It's a richly organic album with layers of synth ambience, acoustic instrumentation, live sounding drums and a lot of field recordings. Even though their 90s material frequently incorporated non-electronic instruments, they were generally utilised in a largely electronic way, with samples and loops. Here, no longer restricted to the tiny memory capabilities of Akai samplers, the band are able to use much longer sections of performances, making the music feel much more live and less rigid. While a slightly snide Discogs comment calling the album the future sound of Amorphous Androgynous is very much an exaggeration, it definitely feels like the sort of record that could only have come about after the Amorphous era. And the Sand Monter tapes and the Woodlands of Old, which both feel like templates for the blend of percussion and other instruments found throughout much of Environments 4. Atmospherically, it's not quite the gloomy forest walk expected from listening to Electric Brainstorm 7, rather having a more exotic feel suggesting distant desert landscapes, while managing to sound absolutely and utterly different to life forms at the same time. For me, it feels like the soundtrack to a prehistoric landscape with no human presence at all. Though very ambient, there are a number of very percussive tracks and, other than the linked opening and closing pieces, comparatively little in the way of the modern classical direction as might have been expected from the album. Similarly, unlike the previous two volumes, there's no viewed from track. Still, the most obvious thing from listening to the album is that it really sounds like a completely new era for the band. At only 50 minutes, it's noticeably shorter than most FSOL albums, and yet there's so much going on that it doesn't feel like it at all. The artwork is really impressive, with an exceptional collage shot on the cover showing some kind of abandoned structure. I can't work out what on earth it is, from both ends, lit in a manner that suggests a low sun. The composition is similar to the mirrored bus station image on the cover of My Kingdom. The now familiar water-damaged or splattered texture is once again present. The title is much larger than on the version seen in the Environment 3 booklet. Much like the first 2 volumes, the booklet contains a mixture of urban and rural landscape shots that don't seem to quite match the mood of the record, although they're mostly very beautiful, particularly the 2 sky shots on the first 2 pages. The centrefold is an odd mirrored tunnel picture, the following 2 pages showing what looks like railway stations, and the final image being a reuse of the tunnel photograph seen on the inside of the Environments 3 booklet. A sterile looking corridor is seen under the disc, and the CD's back cover is a desert photograph that fits the album's mood perfectly and sits alongside the front pretty well. The disc features the same layout as the previous volume, although once again with a new shape, this time a spiked design of rhombuses and triangles. The back cover features a variation of the usual FSOL digital back cover layout, with the tracks aligning left rather than right. The spine returns to the style of earlier FSOL digital releases too. Tellingly, no studio is listed in the credits, although the material is still described as being remixed and enhanced. There was still very much an effort to make this release slightly more under the radar than a massively promoted new album. Brian's home studio is back to being the Church of St Michael's, after several releases named 9 Ley Lines West. Dan Pemberton, Mikey Rowe and Graham Hicks are all credited with input. Unusually, the writing is assigned to FSOL with no mention of Brian or Gaz's actual names. The FSOL digital exploding head and electronic brain violence logos are present on the back cover. As with previous volumes, Shawneen, Vit and Spikey are conspicuous by their absence. As in the time of earlier volumes, vinyl wasn't so much of an ongoing concern at the time of the album's release, with a small operation like FSOL Digital choosing just to stick with the CD, and an LP edition wasn't released until 2015. This came in 2 forms, a 140g edition and a 180g one, both with identical artwork. No booklet or gatefold sadly, and the back cover features the tunnel shot from the inner sleeve. Only the EBV logo is present on the LP. Interestingly, the band name is smaller and written in all caps on both the front and spine of this edition. The LP version features the previous digital bonus track Plough at the end, and copies bought from FSOL Digital come with a download of a further bonus piece, Kamaji. If it wasn't clear from what I've already said, I absolutely love this one. Despite the presence of a couple of familiar samples, it really is for all intents and purposes the proper first new FSOL album in 16 years, and it sounds so different to the bulk of their 90s work, and indeed the previous Environments albums. It took a lot of listening to begin to fully appreciate it. It's always easy to get carried away by the excitement of a new album by one of your favourite bands. Alice in Ultraland and Environments 3 were both my albums of the year at the time, but my enthusiasm for them has waned somewhat in later years. But Environments 4 still sounds as fresh and remarkable to me now, over a decade on, as it did on first listen. It's a rich, warm, incredibly beautiful album, and one that finds FSOL creating another detailed and well-rounded sonic world more than 20 years since their first release. The Wheel of Life. Environments 4 opens on a glorious note with the epic Wheel of Life. The track was developed as part of the soundtrack for the Russian computer game Prime World, which the band contributed music to. It opens with electric guitar notes and huge string chords, bringing to mind the modern classical sound gradually developed over the previous few years. The piece starts bright before moving into darker chords. Then wordless vocals cut through, I believe they're Alicia Sufid from the Amorphous band, Mikey Rowe's electric piano chimes, and all is warm once again. At the halfway point, a dulcimer melody cuts through, followed by harmonium chords, electric guitar plucking away in the background throughout, sounding for all intents and purposes like one of the more ambient tracks by a post-rock band than an electronic work. As an introduction to this new, more organic sounding FSOL, it's perfect and a grand way to open the album. Its themes will reappear later. No Man's Land. With the same mix of choir sounds and gurgling background noises, No Man's Land feels like a sequel to Summer's Dream from Environments 3, even featuring the same eerie atmosphere. Initially developed as an environment for the enhanced version of From the Archives Volume 1, included there as the outro to Hallucination, and even listed on Electric Brainstorm 7 as such, it was later picked for inclusion on Environments 4 as a piece in its own right. And fittingly too, as it really feels like an introduction to River Delta, with a similar atmosphere and being in the same key. It feels like a development of the occasional inclusion of Environments as standalone tracks on Environments 3 and From the Archives Volume 6 2 years prior. River Delta, also known as Cul-de-sac. After an ambient beginning, Environments 4 kicks off properly with River Delta and its layers of tribal percussion. Melodically led by a choir-like synth and choral samples, it's actually quite a dark piece, minor key chords and motifs playing throughout. It feels like a slightly lusher, more developed version of the dark exoticism found on the woodlands of old. A brief breakdown to the backing parts, around 2 minutes 30, reveals field recordings and acoustic guitar chords, adding further organic texture to the mix. Although maybe not as complex in structure as older FSOL works, there are still intriguing moments, such as the addition of a fluttering synth melody in the final minute. A wonderfully evocative and atmospheric piece. A muffled version of it was first heard in the background of Electric Brainstorm 7 the previous year, and a slightly edited version appears on the Mushroom 11 soundtrack as Cul-de-sac. Supercontinents. Completing the trilogy begun with No Man's Land and River Delta, Supercontinents acts as something of a coda and outro environment with synth chords in the same key once again. Layers of unidentified noises fill out the sound, while wordless vocals wail over the top. The piece closes with an unhinged synth melody and fading into tambura notes. Sediment. More ambience here, with tambura notes adding a touch of Amorphous feel to proceedings. The wild synth sound from the end of Supercontinents makes a reappearance, adding to the flowing, seamless feeling of the album in a very sort of life-forms way. Focus comes in the form of what sounds like a dulcimer melody which plays twice before suddenly running through backwards. The final minute introduces a glitchy bass riff before the mood brightens somewhat with fluttering flutes, guitar and piano notes and glockenspiel. Once again, the emphasis here is on live instrumentation over synths. Architecture. Once again, ambience is followed by beats with this heavily percussive track. Clattering, echoing drums play alongside electric bass, distorted synth notes, strings and the perennial female vocal samples. In a very choral style once more. Classic FSOL structures are in place with the different elements coming and going throughout and never all playing at once. The atmosphere continues from the previous few tracks with a dark, slightly menacing feel, the distortion and drums bringing a somewhat chaotic vibe. Just after the 3-minute mark, the main piece cuts out with sitar chords and a sinister laugh. After some choral samples and field recordings, the track moves into an outro environment territory. New synth chords come in, backed by a strange creaking loop and eventually saxophone and guitar riffs that lead into the following track. It's the first time this century that an environment has been used in such a way as to directly reference another track on the album, and it really helps to add the feeling that Environments 4 is a completely original album in its own right. Murmurations. In some ways, a very odd choice of track to release as a lead single, or something thereabouts, especially as it was marketed very much incorrectly as the band's first new track in years. It caused a lot of confusion when it was heard, as it basically sounds like what people then expected from the Amorphous Androgynous, with electric and bass guitars, saxophones and organs all playing various riffs and melodies, circling around each other, and a live-sounding drum loop cut in a really weird place, giving it an oddly stop-start rhythm. Its closest cousin is probably the Amorphous track Riders on the Circadian Rhythm, which has quite a similar vibe, that being admittedly one of the more FSOL-esque Amorphous pieces, and one that featured in an Electric Brainstorm. The bright sound and layers of live playing, albeit chopped up and looped, do feel somewhat at odds with the rest of the album, although after a dark run of tracks it actually acts as a much needed mood brightener and continues the energy built up on Architecture. And without any actual soloing, it's distant enough from the prog excesses of the Amorphous material that it just about fits in here, perhaps as the first point where the psychedelic sound directly influences FSOL material. Structurally, it's a very dense, complex piece with so many elements coming and going throughout. The final 30 seconds move into a closing environment first heard on Electric Brainstorm 7 the previous year, with spoken samples of Suddenly, Where Are We and Yes over Birdsong. Sunsets. Also known as Sun Sets. Sunsets begins with a very old environment featuring chanting monk-like voices that dates back to the early Kiss FM transmissions. It also features as an outer environment on the enhanced edition of Mouth Muse. The piece itself opens with beautiful synth chords and piano playing from Dan Pemberton, one of the brief modern classical moments on Environments 4. This section was first heard on Electric Brainstorms Volume 7. After a minute, a slow acoustic drum beat comes in with organ chords and what sounds like a looped sample of an alarm. The synth opening then plays again, followed by a synth solo. This is very much a return to the dark and melancholic side of the album with a pensive, introspective mood throughout. Piano chords and string notes come in to bring the beautiful track to a close. On the vinyl edition, it's listed as Sun Sets as 2 words. Photosynthesis. After a run of very dense tracks, Photosynthesis acts as a breather, a spacious piece for bright, airy synth pads and field recordings. If Environments 4 had a structure closer to one of the band's 90s albums, it would act as a closing environment for Sunsets, but it works well here as a piece in its own right as well. Stand a little less between me and the sun. Another brief piece, continuing the more uplifting tone, Stand a Little Less consists largely of electric guitar arpeggios with tinkling bells and synths over the top. Very pretty track and one that continues the live instrumentation feel of the album. Fibrillation. The only Environments 4 track to be recognisably related to any earlier material, Fibrillation features bells, flutes and woodwind from the 1997 track Glacier, itself only released in 2008 on Environments 2. The actual feel of the track is very different, however, without Glacier's laid-back drift, instead featuring a bizarre rhythm pieced together from various mechanical samples, whirs, clicks and slams, and sounded more like a rhythmically malfunctioning till than a drum beat. A staccato vocal sample plays throughout, while the bass is in the form of an undulating wave of low sine notes. Flute melodies play over the top and keep the track rooted in the brighter tone of most of the album's second half. Long Day. First encountered as an EMS synthy improvisation set to a time-lapse video on YouTube, Long Day then appeared on Electric Brainstorms Volume 7 with synth chords at the beginning. The final version on Environments 4 starts with these sweeping synthy noises before moving into an environment section featuring the rook sounds heard regularly on Amorphous releases, a bleeping sound first heard in Glass's closing environment, a spoken sample of Walt Whitman poem also heard on EBS 7, and beautiful synth chords. The EMS sounds briefly return for the outro. Fast Landscape. Fast Landscape was first heard on Electric Brainstorm 7 once again, and it was with some surprise that it turned out to be an FSOL track, with muted guitar chops and a lo-fi drum machine acting as percussion throughout, and only odd, stark synth drones, muffled voices and reverse samples added on top. Sounds much closer to one of Brian's more minimalistic side projects like Parts Submerged than anything previously released under the FSOL banner. It's a particularly strange piece to include as Environments 4's penultimate track, where one might expect something more climactic or cinematic, but then when have FSOL ever done anything conventional like that? The closing environment features more bells, mangled voice chanting and metallic shaking. Clear Light of Reality. Environments 4 concludes in a surprising manner with a reprise of opening track The Wheel of Life. It's not a move the band had made before, but it's an incredibly successful one, with that track's beautiful epic feel being just as much at home at the end of the album as the start. The guitar is higher in the mix and there are a couple of reversed sitar notes as well as some mid-90s sounding synth bubbles. As the dulcimer notes echo away into silence, there's a real feeling of having been on a journey, a wonderful album closer. Plough, also known as Orderly Fashion. An alternative version of Fibrillation featuring some of the same percussion and woodwind notes first heard on Glacier, as well as the same wobbly sine wave bass sound. The tempo is faster, however, and the mood much more melancholic with dark synth chords and a sad sounding piano melody. It closes with an environment of layered field recordings and chanted notes. The track is actually much closer to the mood of Environments 4 itself than Fibrillation in fact, and I've often wondered why it wasn't chosen in place of that track. I asked Brian and he believes it was probably completed after the main album was delivered to the manufacturers, hence it being a bonus track. The piece comes as a bonus with the digital version when purchased through fsoldigital.com, and it was later added to the vinyl edition under the name The Plough. It also appears on the Mushroom 11 soundtrack as Orderly Fashion, featuring additional sounds in the intro. Kamaji. Carja comes as a bonus MP3 with purchases of the Environments 4 vinyl edition through fsworlddigital.com only. What's interesting is that it appears to be an Environments 3 outtake using these same guitar notes as Sense of Being and similar percussive sounds as Surface Water. Still, there are nice bouncy bass notes and synth pads in the mix, making it an enjoyable track if slightly out of place in context of Environments 4. It closes with an outer environment consisting of melancholic piano notes and distortion. The Amorphous Androgynous Finland gig, July 2012. A live gig in Finland, not once mentioned officially anywhere on official sites, newsletters or social media, and only discovered by FSOL board member Dell a couple of weeks after the event. Apparently the Mellow Hippo Disco show was played. The FSOL board thread about the gig received a few angry replies from fans, including one from a Finnish fan who wished they could have attended. As I said at the time, hey guys, why not announce your gigs somewhere, eh? And on that note, we've reached the end of today's video. Thank you very much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed it. Give me some of your thoughts on the music down below. I'd love to read them. And please do drop me a like, subscribe or share. These things all really help my channel. I will be back next week with a video rounding up the rest of the music from 2012, and I hope you'll join me then.